Tucked away in the archive of a local Oklahoma newspaper lies an unusual article written over a century ago. The article makes an extraordinary claim about a lesser-known tale from World War I. A tale that, if true, as the article suggests, would turn an outrageous yet terrifying myth of World War I into perhaps the most horrifying true story of the entire war. The article, published on August 14th, 1919, quite randomly in the Ada News, features an account from a Canadian veteran of the First World War, and more specifically, the Battle of Mons. Under the headline, "American Wolfhound with Brain of a Man was Terror to No Man's Land," the article reads, Montreal, Canada, August 9th. That weird legend of no man's land, the gruesome epic of the Hound of Mons, has, according to F.J. Woodhouse, a returned Canadian veteran, been vindicated throughout Europe as fact and not fiction. For 4 years, civilian skeptics laughed at the soldier's tale of a giant skulking hound which stalked among the corpses and shell holes of no man's land and dragged down British soldiers to their death. An apparition of fear-crazed minds, they said, but to the soldiers it was a reality, and one of the most terrible figures of the World War. The death of Dr. Gottlieb Huckmuller in the recent Spartakan riots in Berlin, said Captain Newhouse, has brought to light facts concerning the fiendish application of this German scientist's skill that have astounded Europe. For the Hound of Mons was not an accident, a phantom, or a hallucination. It was the deliberate result of one of the most strangest and most repulsive scientific experiments the world has ever known. Teeth marks in throat. What was the Hound of Mons? According to the soldiers, the legend started in the terrible days of the defense of Mons. On the night of November 14th, 1914, Captain Yeskis and 4 men of the London Fusiliers entered no man's land on a patrol. The last living trace of them was when they started into the darkness between the lines. Several days afterward, their dead bodies were found, just as they had been dragged down, with teeth marks at the throat. Several nights later, a weird, blood-curdling howl was heard from the darkness toward which the British trenches faced. It was the howl of the Hound of Mons. From then on, this phantom hound became the terror of the men who faced death by bullets with a smile. It was the old fear of the unknown. The idea of an unusually large hound haunting the trenches of World War I makes for a terrifying idea, and the visuals conjured up by the mind are petrifying. However, the story does suffer from several historical implausibilities. Firstly, the Battle of Mons was, in many ways, a battle of movement. The war was not yet one of trenches and foolhardy infantry charges. Instead, the British and French, with some Belgian allies, under pressure from the German advance, moved at a brisk pace in a series of withdrawals from the original line at Mons to the outskirts of Paris, where the Germans would ultimately be held around 3 weeks later. The pace of action meant that the static fortified trenches, and therefore the infamous no man's land, had yet to appear. At this stage, the war was characterized by the pushing and shoving of offensives and counter-offensives. This would mean that the setting of the Hound of Mons tale and the supposed accounts of F.J. Newhouse would have been highly inaccurate, Not to mention the extraordinary claim that the creature, if fact, actually had a human brain. According to Neuhaus, a fearsomely nationalistic German scientist by the name of Gottlieb Hochmuller conducted obscene experiments with human and animal subjects. One experiment included the implanting of a human volunteer's brain into that of a large dog. The brain gave the dog a unique level of intelligence and aggression, and also resulted in the animal becoming an enormous size and capable of identifying and therefore targeting British troops from their uniform. Though the experiment is completely impossible, there is also no apparent existence of a professor by the name of Gottlieb Hochmuller. As for Captain Yeskis of the London Fusiliers, much like the rest of the story, this account falls apart even under the faintest of scrutiny. From the November date, coming after the Battle of Mons had ended, to the lack of a specific regiment named the London Fusiliers, it's impossible to consider these attacks as anything other than fanciful. So why did the story come about? The war was already rife with real horrors and tales of wildlife, including dogs, wolves, rats and more, gnawing on the dead and dying in no man's land. That same space between the lines was also rumoured to harbour feral squads of deserters who hid in abandoned forward trenches and dugouts. They would murder and apparently consume those who strayed too close, and their silhouettes roaming the torn landscape at night gave soldiers on both sides nightmares. However, one story above all others may have inspired the Hound of Mons. The so-called Angels of Mons, a great biblical appearance of angelic figures, was said to have appeared between retreating British soldiers and rapidly advancing Germans. It is said that this angelic sight so overwhelmed the Germans that they withdrew and the British were saved from certain doom. Though this story, which was printed in the British press at the time, was simply propaganda, the story of Hochmuller's Hound provided the perfect counterpoint, particularly in post-war Gothic horror. The creature created a demonic force, not only to counter the grace of the angels, but to present the unforgiven Germans as the beastly Hun the Allies came to defeat. More understandably still, perhaps, it became a devil, a monster that could take responsibility for at least some of the unimagined barbarity of the so-called Great War. Undoubtedly, we will revisit World War I in future videos, given the many tales of ghostly soldiers, phantom archers, and mass vanishings throughout the conflict. However, in the meantime, please like and subscribe for more bite-sized bits of the bizarre.